Hello, hello. I'm your host for today, Dr. Carrie Jones, and I am so excited to have the one, the only Dr. Paul Conti here on the Root Cause Medicine podcast. He is a Stanford trained psychiatrist with over 20 years of experience. He's the author of Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, and he has been on numerous famous podcasts. So it was a real honor to talk with him today. We covered a lot of issues around the emotional health, the emotional well-being, specifically of women as they make the transitional state from perimenopause to menopause. This is a really big time for a lot of women. They're going through a lot of emotions. They're going through a lot of body changes. A lot of things come up for them. And I really wanted to talk with Dr. Conti around his practice and how he works with women making this transition. We talked about trauma, how he defines trauma. We talked about shame and feeling less than, especially as women go through this transition. And we also talked about resilience, because there's that quote out there that says, what doesn't kill you make you stronger. Dr. Conti feels what doesn't kill you might kill you or make you weaker. And we have to talk about that because our resilience goes down, especially our emotional health, our mental health resilience can go down as we get older. And he really walked us through what all these definitions are, and most importantly, what you can do about it. He was all about the practical and tactical, and you know I am here for that. So I can't wait for you to listen. Dr. Paul Conti, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast. I am so excited to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And I love talking to a fellow Portlander who on this beautiful day, finally, our summer has arrived, sort of.
Finally, a beautiful day, right? We'll take it.
We will take it. Well, I have heard you talk about emotional health, obviously brilliantly, so many times on so many podcasts all over the world. And I work with women going through perimenopause, menopause, the hormonal transition. And I feel like a lot of the big research, as it should, goes to cardiovascular health, bone health, brain health, but we're missing the emotional health part. And I find the emotional health part is where they struggle the most. So hormones get pinpointed, obviously, but for a lot of people, the climate of emotions in this stage, they're not doing so hot. And that's really where I kind of want to take this conversation today, because women are like, okay, avoid breast cancer, don't get heart disease, try not to get dementia, but I'm falling apart. The rug is being pulled out from under me. Do you see that a lot?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I do. I think there are two different issues that are kind of coming together. One is, if you imagine the psychological aspects of the transition and then some of the physical impacts of the transition, like there's a lot going on in a person. So that in and of itself can sort of push towards depression or create anxiety, even in people who don't pre-existing have those things. But more often what we see is that it can exacerbate what's already there and underlined. So we have the issue of the psychological impact of the transition and how our society views the transition. Like there's so much there to deal with. And then on top of that, there is the direct effect of the hormonal changes on all sorts of things. It's so pervasive in the brain, so it can directly affect mood states, anxiety, sleep. The way that we think of ourselves from moment to moment can shift. And the problem is, the first issue I talked about is not addressed well enough in our society. And the second issue is really not addressed well enough. In fact, often it's not addressed at all. And we commonly, over the 25 years of my career, we'll see a person who's transitioned into menopause and maybe is now on hormones or whatever the person may be doing, but doesn't understand, because no one has said anything about it, that, oh, those panic attacks that are there now, or the person comes in and will say something negative, oh, I just can't handle it, or they're feeling something negative about themselves because no one has pointed out or acknowledged, hey, this is a really big transition. We have to track along with all sorts of things, right? How you're doing psychologically and the direct effect upon the neurotransmitters that determine our state of being. Much like we see that sometimes with changes in oral contraceptives, where like everything is really different mental health wise, but the person isn't putting together like, oh, that change. There's always a question you ask, right? If there's any change hormonally, because that is so often the underlying cause of difficulties that's not identified. And then that makes it 10 times harder for the person, of course.
I think you hit on a key point there for a lot of women, that nobody's acknowledged that part. Nobody's acknowledged like, hey, you're going through this transition and it's reverse puberty and it's a whole new world. It's a whole new you. And it's okay to probably feel the emotions, shame, anger, fear, loss, as you move into this new state.
Yeah, I think the whole new you part being there is a real transition and some things are different, right, on the other side of the transition, but we also want continuity, right? So it shouldn't be that mood state is dramatically different. Energy levels are dramatically different. And I've absolutely seen where a woman will attribute to menopause all these negative things that are really, some of them are coming from things that can actually be accessed and treated, right? Instead of where people go, right, is just to self-blaming if we don't understand. So I think spreading the word and the news is so important, because this is not uncommon at all, that it's the underlying cause of some issues that are not being sorted out, perhaps after several visits to different physicians, right? And now things are just so much worse because now it's there and it's been there for a while and the person doesn't think it's going to change. And they feel that too much of the whole new you, where they can lose the continuity with the self of the past. And that shouldn't have to happen.
Right. Maybe I should lay some groundwork. I realize with people listening, when we talk about cardiovascular health, bone health, how do you define emotional health? If somebody's listening, they understand their heart, high blood pressure, they understand the brain, dementia, they understand don't get osteoporosis. But sometimes people aren't as in tune or as in touch or aware of the emotional health part.
Right. And just a general definition would be that we can handle pretty well or reasonably well the stressors in our lives. That there isn't something that's overwhelming us, right? So if someone's having panic attacks or low energy, concentration, they can't function, like these are things that are telling us there's something that warrants attention, right? Because the idea is stressors are stressful, and it's not that we're not supposed to be stressed by them, but if they're driving us to a place of panic or of such deep insecurity, right? Or they're driving a person to a place they just don't feel like they can cope anymore and they're sort of hiding from the world. Like these are the things that tell us that let's go look at our mental health, because it's supposed to serve us well. Like our bodies aren't perfect and there are always things for us to attend to, but the idea is that they're serving us well. We can do the things we need to do. We're not in pain all the time, right? The same translates to mental health, which is just, it's the same principle. It's just applied in a way that really is just less esoteric, because often the pain that we feel up here is felt in ways that aren't like, oh, like my knee hurts, right? It's a lot easier to identify that. And then also there are routes to go get help for that. And oftentimes there's stigma about anything that's going on inside of us that's impacting our mental health. And I mean, every single person, we all have our mental health issues. Like life is stressful, right? So this idea that there's absolutely no shame, and we need to be able to look at ourselves. And I often say the work that I do is all about empowerment. And I guess it's the work that you do too. We're empowering people in different ways. And one way that we empower people is with knowledge, right? And another way is with the removal of stigma, of saying there's nothing to be ashamed of about this whatsoever. Like if you don't understand what's going on, right, you don't feel like you're in control of it, you feel like you're not being heard, like you have to say something, right? Like we have to be our own advocate, especially in a healthcare system that sometimes will pay good attention to us. There are many people out there trying to do the best job they can, but the system itself is broken, right? So people often do not get the attention they need. And this idea that if you don't understand, you're not comfortable, like you have to be the squeaky wheel, right? That's ultimately the only way we get our needs met.
Here. I absolutely agree with that. I feel that a lot of women, especially again in this transition, how are you doing? And they're like, I'm fine. I'm doing fine. Everything's fine. And meanwhile, just like that meme, the house is burning down around them as they're sitting at the kitchen table. And so how do you work with that when you come in, they tell you the whole story and you're like, holy Moses, that's a story. They go, no, I'm fine. No, you're not.
Right. I think first, it's really the rapport is so important that you try and establish that this is a place to talk about all of that, right? It's a visit to a physician, right? It's okay to talk about all of it, because often the I'm fine comes before the story, and then there won't be a story, right? Unless we ask. And sometimes you really do have to ask. I mean, this idea in medicine that there's certain things that we should ask about when we see someone. And this is one of them, instead of just presuming, oh, that's not a mental health thing. It crosses OBGYN and psychiatry. Like it's a mental health thing and has to be viewed that way. And I try and help people understand that there's no judgment about it. Like I just want to understand so I can help. And with some building of rapport and some encouragement, then a person can start talking about things. And I think once a person starts talking, almost always it gets easier. You're like, okay, I understand, because they may be talking about something and expecting like, well, I don't understand that, or what's wrong with you, or things people expect in our stigmatizing world can be very negative. That's why people often aren't forthcoming. But as soon as they see like, okay, we talk about this and I start thinking, look, there's something to do about this. Like there are things that we can do about it. Then that's encouraging. And then now we're in problem solving mode when a person may have not raised that in the first place because they think the problem is them and there's no solving the problem. And again, I think it's a shame on our medical system for a lot of reasons, but that's one of them.
So expanding on that, I want to talk about both resilience and then trauma. So I'll start with resilience. And I've heard you say this before in other podcasts. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger is not true. What doesn't kill you can almost kill you or make you weaker. And there's obviously a lot on social media around resilience right now and building up our resilience and doing all of these biohacker things for resilience. But at what point is it the emotion health is resilience and it's good for you? And at what point have you pushed beyond and maybe somebody is close to collapse?
Well, people have different capacities for resilience. Some of it may be innate or genetically determined. So it's nature and nurture, right? A lot of it is the situations that we're in and how we're functioning. So one, we want to be as healthy as we can because we will be more resilient, right? So we want to take care of ourselves in mind and body. And also resilience is like always called for, right? Like if it's not called for today, it will be tomorrow, right? So we don't want to need resilience for things that we can approach in a different way. I'll say sometimes, how about using the resilience for something else? There's gonna be a better place for it. Like, let's address this in a way that you don't have to utilize that. So I think that the first aspect is prevention, it's information, right? But we know it's sort of biologically true that when there are traumas that affect us, that change the way our brains are functioning. So for example, the brain functions different and now we're more vigilant, right? Or the brain functions different and now we have higher levels of baseline tension, right? Like we have something there that we need to deal with. Like it's a problem, right? It's a mental health problem that warrants attention. Now, can we push through that with resilience? Like, sure, but it's in a sense, it's not the right tool for the job, right? The tool for the job is understanding that, addressing the mental health issues so that the resilience can really push that person forward. So I am all for, I think resilience is maybe the best thing we have. And sometimes people ask questions, if you could wave a magic wand and give one thing to your children or something, right? And I think the quality, I think maybe would be resilience, right? Because like we are all going to get knocked down in life, right? It's going to happen. So we need to be able to get back on our feet, but it's very, very hard to do unless we have some understanding of ourselves. And the idea is like, what's going on in my mind and body, and also in the mind and body as one. I mean, the two intercommunicate. So for example, the stress and tension in the brain can fire neurons that then are making tension in muscles in the body, right? And that may prompt IBS symptoms, just as one example. It may prompt bladder problems and bladder irritation or chest tightness, right? So this happens from mind to body, but then when the body is like that, it's sending signals back to the mind, to the brain saying, hey, there's a lot of tension here. It makes sense to be anxious. So then we sort of have this escalating ping pong from mind to body. And the thought is, if we're going to take care of ourselves, we have to look at how am I taking care of my body? How am I taking care of my mind? And how about mind and body? Because it is one thing. And if we start looking at that and we start trying to assess, like, how have stressors impacted us? What can help me so that when I'm at the point that I'm calling upon resilience, I've set the odds in my favor as best I can, which again brings me back to empowerment of there shouldn't be a mystery to this, right? A person who's going through menopause should be able to say, like, I want to have all questions answered, right? And of course, there are resources out there like this. We're being a resource, and that's great, and that's worth a lot, right? But there's no substitute if you don't know what's going on for sitting with someone who is a physician treating you and making sure that you get those questions answered. I think everybody has a right to that, but often we have to realize it and advocate for ourselves to get that. Then we see with greater clarity. Right? We see with greater clarity what may be, for example, hormonal adjustment. Maybe that's something that could be done. Maybe there are medicines that are not hormonal adjustment that can impact some of the physical things that happen in menopause. Maybe there are mental health issues that are coming directly or indirectly from menopause. There are things we can do there. Like there's so much that we can do. And it's not just medicines. Of course, like medicines often are a part of it, but sometimes it's medicines and therapy, or it's different kinds of self-care, of meditation, exercise. Like there's so much that can be done. But it's like nothing ever gets done unless we acknowledge that there's something that needs to be done. And then we go seek some solution state to it, like some way that I learn things, I do things, and then I feel better.
And I wish this was taught in school. Like I wish we learned it from a very young age, self-care and therapy and ways to improve resilience, because as I'm sure you see all the time, very grown adults who really struggle and were never taught any of these things. at any age. They're just dipping their toe into it. Maybe their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. And it's such a disservice to all of us and the mental health state that we're kind of all in.
Oh, I agree completely. I think there's so many things that we don't teach at all, let alone like teach in elementary school. And there's so much that can be gained by exposing children, right, to the ideas of like how to understanding, for example, like bullying. Like, what does that mean? What does it say about the person who's doing the bullying? Like the idea that it's not you, it's that there's something in them that's causing them to lash out. So that can help people fight against the stigma of it. And also systems can realize, why is the person bullying? What's going on in their lives? Like let's take a look at how we make systems better, lives better, help people understand, right? And we don't do that not only in these formative years when it can make a massive amount of difference, but we don't do it in later years either. And I think this is part of the popularity of podcasts that are informing, right? Because it's not a great way to go and get really sort of firsthand personalized information. So when there's a trusted source, we start doing some of the education that should have come sooner. So on the one hand, we can say, hey, better late than never, right? That's true. But also, why late, right? Like, why does it have to be late? Are there things that we can do both in early childhood education all the way through medical education and training so that we don't have to be continuing to have this conversation? Because when I started doing this like 20 something years ago, about a quarter of a century ago, this was a thing. You know, a woman would come in with new onset panic attacks, like things are really different. And why is her sleep different? And she's depressed. And it's a third referral. And then she comes in and she's lamenting what's wrong with her. Well, she's in perimenopause or she's in menopause. And then we talk about it. Well, 25 years later, that's not really that different, right? So the systems are not doing a good job when we identify problems that are really problems about information, right? They're problems about education. They're problems about just knowing things and systems being attentive, and they don't shift over long periods of time. So we do have responsibilities to change these systems around us, and we in different ways work towards that, right? But what we're talking about, I think, here is the one-on-one, the person's responsibility to themselves of like even just stopping and thinking like, why is it that I feel different, right? Because sometimes we don't think, we just presume, well, now something's wrong with me, or we get self-faulting rapidly, or we just make some attitude, it's menopause, I can't do anything about it, right? But again, even identifying that it's menopause, so often is not done, even when once we talk about it, it's so obvious to the person, like, oh my goodness, like this happened over exactly that period of time. But if you're not thinking that menopause is related to mental health things and the functioning of our brains, then you don't know to make that. The link is obvious, but it's not obvious unless you know there's a possibility of a link, right? So I think just stopping and thinking is a first responsibility. And then whatever it is you don't understand or you feel like I could use help with, to make sure that you get it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hands down to that. I love that you brought the example of bullying up, which we often think is a childhood thing, but many adults that I know have dealt with bullies that were full grown adults. And imagine if we had learned everything you just said in childhood about bullying, and then as we get older, can apply it in our jobs, in relationships, and pseudo friendships or whatever.
Absolutely. Early on in my career, I did some work where I was doing some psychotherapy in nursing home settings. And I learned so much from it. I learned like all the dynamics that can go on in us when we're children, right? The sort of middle school dynamics, they don't stop unless like something happens to change them. So we can get healthier as we get older. We can pay attention to ourselves and we can grow and we can do all of these things. But you see what happens when a person doesn't do that. And it was quite a reality to say, oh, wow, like that person who I think was a bully when they were 7 is it now that when they're 87, right? We don't change just because we age. Like our brains are amazing and more powerful and amazing than any supercomputer, but there are things they don't do. Right? They don't go back and look like the kind of reboot and patch things. They don't do that and say, wait, what's different now? Like, I'm not a child, right? I'm an adult. How might I behave? Because sometimes the person who was bullied then at 7 is still bullied at 87, right? We haven't taught how to take care of oneself, and we don't learn those things by osmosis. And we don't learn it just because the person may be intelligent and attuned to other people. Like that doesn't tell us things we don't know, right? So that's another way of saying like no harm, no foul. If you're at any stage of life, like, hey, they're like kind of significant things about me that I don't get, or significant things about why I don't feel I'm functioning well. Why am I the person who always seems to get the short end of the stick in a group of people or in an occupational setting? Why do people treat me this way? Whatever it may be, like we can stop and look at that. And there's no shame if it's happening later in life. other than the shameful systems that don't educate us and guide us along so we don't have to be facing these things later in life.
Well, and so speaking of, I want to talk about trauma. How do you in particular define or determine trauma? Because I've heard you say before that with like chronic traumas, especially feeling less than. And while I know there are a huge wide variety of traumas out there, one of the repeated things that will come up as women hit their 40s and 50s is feeling less than. They're less useful, they're less reproductive, they're having all these changes on top of the trauma that they've maybe already experienced through their life. So how do you define it? How do you determine that?
Sure. I think when a word is used so often in so many ways, like trauma, right, we have to define what we're talking about. Right? And the idea here is it's not a gray area. It's not something soft. Right? The definition is when something has happened and there are changes in the brain. So there are identifiable changes in the brain. So something traumatic, so to speak, could happen. Right. But if on the other side of it, like my brain is the same, like it didn't feel good, and maybe there was real pain to it physically, mentally, and some intrusive thoughts even, and avoidance for some period of time. But that doesn't mean the brain has changed, right? If the brain has changed, we are fundamentally different. This is the scenario where a person's brain is just more vigilant, right? See a new person, instead of looking, does that person look pleasant? Or see a new person and there's an automatic reaction of fear or mistrust. Okay, that is a change in the brain. So what I always try and point out is the definition of trauma that I'm using is a hard science definition. Has your brain changed? Right? Now, again, we can't just determine that with a blood test, right? What we can is we can introspect to ourselves. Am I more avoidant? Do I just feel different? Are my sleep patterns different? Are my mood different? Are my anxiety levels different? Are my behaviors different? Am I shying away from things that I might have walked towards before? Right? These are the things that point us towards, hey, there's some brain change that is going on. And for example, the biggest, I think, most impactful thing I sometimes say about this is how when these changes happen in us, we age faster than the calendar. So the idea is we say, how old is a person? You say, oh, that person is 35 or that person is 65. Well, yes, by the calendar, but what are we really asking? Maybe we're asking, like, how old are they inside? Right? Like, what's going on with their DNA and telomeres and all these things that are determining our age inside of us? That person may be 40 by the calendar and 45 by what's actually happening inside of them. So when trauma changes us, we from head to toe are different in ways that are not good for us. So this is not, like we say, post-trauma resilience. Again, I'm all for resilience, but if things are actually changed, we have to acknowledge that in order for the resilience to really come into play. And these changes in us, we know can happen in the sort of classic way, so to speak, which is acute traumas. People first started thinking about traumas in the context of combat and war. Right? People were shell-shocked, and they were seeing that people were different. So they were starting to notice, like, oh, trauma does something, and that something is not good, right? That what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I mean, see someone who had descriptions of people were shell-shocked, right? Like, people knew that wasn't true. So they were trying to understand it. And then our thoughts about trauma and our research is very much focused on acute trauma, the death of someone, a physical injury, a car accident, someone being assaulted. We're very focused on acute traumas. Look, that's not the only way that the brain can change. So if we're going to look at it through the lens of science and medicine, we're looking at brain change and we're looking at, well, what causes brain changes? And yes, it can be acute traumas. It can also be chronic and vicarious trauma. So if you're going through life with a chronic sense of being less than, right? Or if the world around you is treating you that way. So the sense of less than you have inside is being reinforced externally. Like, that can make brain changes too. Another way of looking at it is, let's say if you fill up the bucket, the scales tip, right? And now we're in the place of trauma. Well, you could do that by pouring water all into the bucket at once, and now the scales tip, but you can pour it in slowly too. And that's where these kinds of traumas get so underappreciated and under-identified and undertreated, even within a person. How many people who have chronic trauma that's coming from some form of prejudice or discrimination will say they will present with clear and strong signs and symptoms of trauma having changed the brain, and then they will say, I've had no trauma. So we need to understand what not just acute, but chronic and also vicarious traumas. We know those brain changes can come from our ability to be empathic. Like, thank goodness humans are empathic, right? It's how we can love each other, take care of one another, but it's also how another person's pain and injury can come through to us. And this is why very often what I'm telling people or writing down on the prescription is no more news, right? Or look at news in order to see what the news is, and then don't look at the news anymore, right? So one way we can be traumatized by other people's pain and suffering, which sometimes people will get very deeply into through the news, which that's not news anymore. And it's an attempt at it comes from an empathic place, or it's from an attempt to understand, someone who's suffering. It comes from a good place, but the person can end up very traumatized. Again, these kind of things can happen when we're around people who are suffering. So the kind of trauma where I think most talking about here is not the acute or the vicarious, but it's more the chronic trauma of a society that in so many ways just becomes automatically or overtly denigrating to women around the time of menopause. If the society is kind of set up that way, right? So we already have a situation that so paves the way for this kind of chronic trauma, which means it's even more important that we identify, we don't want to add on top of that, the thought that oh, what's wrong with me? It's my fault that I'm having panic attacks now and I can't function. This is as unhelpful as it can be. So we need to be able to identify where this word knowledge is power and curiosity. I say curiosity about self, just stopping and thinking about yourself. If you're different in some way, why might that be? Right. And maybe that leads a person to track, oh, right, this is the period of time going into menopause. Or maybe it's something else that's identified. It could be a relationship that over time has become less healthy and treads into unacceptable territory. It could be a job that was a good job to have that now is oppressive. There are a lot of things that can go on inside of us that we don't identify unless we stop and we think about ourselves. And certainly how complicated and the differential duration of how perimenopause to menopause proceeds. I mean, something that is so different across people means we have to be curious about that. It's not like I say, it's not like we have lights that go off when we have a certain problem. Then we know, right? I mean, that's not how our minds and bodies work. And certainly with something that occurs in different people in different ways and across long periods of time, there's where we have to be vigilant. And the best way to be vigilant is just being curious about oneself in mind and body. And very often, if someone is coming in for mental health issues and we identify that's why energy, confidence, concentration has changed. Now we very, very clearly see it. And then we take a physical symptom inventory. We see there very clearly physical symptoms going on. These persons having night sweats is making them miserable, right? They're having changes in vaginal lubrication, and then they feel worse about themselves, right? They feel worse about what society's adding. And the thought is their physical symptoms, and often the person isn't mapping those things because the light bulb hasn't gone off. And we're all built like that. Unless we're curious, there are things that can be obvious after the fact, but they're not obvious, right? After the fact is not a sign of obviousness. We need curiosity and also the unwillingness to say, well, I don't understand, but I guess it's okay. Or I went and saw that doctor who wrote a prescription, told me something I didn't quite understand, or didn't make sense, and I guess that's it. We just can't accept that.
I love that. I was going to ask you, well, what do we do? And the get curious part, I think, is not natural for a lot of people, because how many times have everyone listening, talk to a friend, let's say, and the friend is going on lamenting, and as the outsider, we're like, that has changed you. Don't you remember? You started that job, whatever, 2 years ago, and now your whole personality, it's an awful job. Can't you see it's the job? And they're like, no. What?
It's, the thing people say about the frog in hot water doesn't notice the water is getting hotter. And also, trauma changes us. So there's that. And there's also, if a person has gone through trauma that has made brain changes, right, those changes so deeply impact a person. And the example I give, because I think it's so compelling, is if it's a real story of a person who won an award in high school that was a great award to win and was a real sort of feather in her cap in terms of intelligence and interpersonal skills and perseverance. It was a great thing. And she saw it that way. It was a marker that, hey, you can go out into the world and do your thing. But she went through some terrible trauma not long thereafter. And then when she presented, it wasn't so long after the award in high school, but she saw it as an insult, as a mark of shame, as a mockery, right? The idea of here's the best thing you're ever going to get because you're not going anywhere, right? And she couldn't say, she did not know that she thought about it differently. She had no ability to access the feelings that she had, the enthusiasm that she had. Then this is how the trauma changes us, which is why we have to be curious. Whether it's introspection, it's writing, it's talking to people who know us. There are ways we have to be able to take stock of ourselves with curiosity, or we may not ever notice changes in us that are readily addressable. So that part about curiosity is so important, and how other people around us often see us in ways that we don't. Right? So asking trusted others, like, I'm not feeling as well as I did before, whatever it may be. I'm not quite sure why. Like, do you see anything? And sometimes that yields really, really good information.
Especially because people generally like to give their opinion. So if they're close to you, they're probably going to openly tell you, like, yes, I noticed with this relationship or this job or these things have been adding up over time and you've become a different person.
Yeah, a person you know to be a good person in your life and a safe person is going to welcome that opportunity. And a lot of times another person has seen it but doesn't know how to say it, right? So that's the other side of it too. If you see there's something different in someone that you care about, we think about what's the right situation and how to do so. But it's good for us to say something about that, because often people don't want to. They want to make the person feel bad. They're worried the person will get upset. And then they're seeing things that are very clearly not okay, but not saying anything about them. So the curiosity about self through self and others is just so important. And we see it. One of the things that we do here is we do intensive work with people who will come and spend a couple of days with us or spend a week with us. Sometimes couples will come, and sometimes we're addressing like real problems, right? But most of the time, like, it's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're fostering curiosity and introspection and opinions from different people who are in professional places that help that person reflect. So we see that when there's a set and setting for a person to do that, that it is just of so much benefit, and that people so welcome that. The reason that demand for that service here is so high is because there's not enough opportunities, right, out there to be able to do that. So I think a lesson of that is to foster the opportunities that you have in your own life. Like, who are trusted friends? If you've seen them in a while, go out with someone and go for a jog or have a cup of coffee or go for a hike and talk about life or the things that we might let slip in our lives that make us more and more isolated. And we see that, and we will see that at times. It's not rare to see that around menopause. Now, society is less approving. Person doesn't feel as good about themselves. There are things going on inside. And then what you see is the person slowly is retracting from life. Look, that is so bad, right? Because the person is then retracting from the very things that keep us healthy, right? If we're going to stay healthy in mind and body, but how do we fight Alzheimer's disease? All these things that can come to us as we get older is we want to have active brains. We want to be with other people. We want to be thinking and learning. So this isolation that can slowly happen to a person through the chronic trauma of the stigma of isolation and change can have some very serious effects down the road. And we see that sometimes too. So the idea, like, this is important. Everything about our health is important. And like, menopause is something to pay attention to. And people know that we're already starting off in a better place.
So along those same lines, let's talk about shame. So when somebody is trying to listen to this and trying to get curious about themselves, but shame is the prevailing emotion, so they stuff it right down. Because if they get curious about it, like, ooh, that's too much. How do we deal with that?
Shame is public enemy number one. Right? Trauma is so pervasive in the society around us. The brain changes of trauma are so pervasive, and a reflex to trauma is shame. Is that 100%? If it's not 100%, it's pretty darn close. That it's what keeps us closed off after we have trauma. And I reflect on my own life, and I talk publicly about my brother dying by suicide and how just the reflexive shame I felt. Right? And it wasn't like I felt shame because I thought about it and decided I should be ashamed. No, I felt shame and then back mapped why I should be ashamed. Right? Because I should have paid more attention. It wasn't if I should pay more attention that makes me ashamed. It's the reflex of it. And we come right at shame. I say, shame is a thing that's the last thing we're going to let hide. Right? So we talk about shame. We talk about shame is so natural in us. Why do we feel it? And then we start looking for attribution. Right? And that's how we really help, because the thought is like, say, someone who's assaulted, right? And then they feel ashamed afterwards. There's absolutely shame to be had. And it's for the person who did the assault. Right? But if a person doesn't go stop and think about that, they feel ashamed, and then they back map the reasons why. I shouldn't have been in that place and I wouldn't have got assaulted, right? Why are people saying that? It's not because the person's trying to rationalize their way into feeling bad. It's because the trauma creates a reflex of shame. And if we go and look at that, like, why should I be ashamed? Maybe there's a good reason. As I say to people, if you're feeling ashamed and you're stealing candy from babies, that's good. You should feel shame about that. Shame is very powerful in humans, right? It alters behavior in ways that have survival adaptations. Not that all shame is bad. It's just that the vast majority of it is a response to trauma that ends up being directed inward of what's wrong with me? I'm beating up on myself. If we do this reflexively after the loss of someone to suicide or after an assault where it's so clear to everyone, like a person had no hand in that happened to that person, if we can decide why it's our fault, why we should feel bad, how we should feel bad in those situations, we can do it in any situation. So the idea is shame is public enemy number one, and it's invisible, it acts like a virus. There's all these ways we can say we can't see it. So we have to know that it's there. Look at the shame that is inside of you, whoever you are, and see there may be reasons to change something, right? Maybe a person is like not being so kind to someone else when they should. Great, let the shame alter your behavior. But when we look at shame, what we most often find are that there's an internal oppression coming from trauma that doesn't have to be there. We get many people come out the other side of the shame, but we have to talk about it. If you shove it away and you don't look at it, that will never happen. What ends up happening is a person, we hear this all the time saying, oh, I can't go look at that. I can't think about that because I'll start crying and I'll never stop, or I'll curl up in a fetal position. I'll never get out of it. I say, that's never happened. No one has ever curled up in a fetal position and cried until they died of dehydration. Like, it's not what happens, but it feels so bad. The shame feels so bad. And thinking again about trauma feels so bad. Even if it's chronic trauma, I felt good about myself, and now I have it for a long time. And we've got to go look at that, because that's how we say, is there a reason for shame? And we come to what is the attribution? And so often the person can redirect that and not feel ashamed, because we're calling upon other mechanisms. We're calling upon other emotions, the ability to use logic, the strength of the relationship. But again, if we don't go look at that and the shame is off over here, right, then it doesn't happen. And that's part of what I think is often tragic about trauma, is we see something that we know we can do something about, and we do. And 3 months later, I'm just making it up, the time, that person is doing so much better, but that could have happened 20 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. I love that we have these conversations. I love that you have these conversations in your book, in your clinic with so many other podcasters, because shame is shameful, and trauma is often nearly 100% shameful for people, whether it's warranted or not. It doesn't get talked about, it gets stuffed down, and then it does show up, and like the book, right? The body keeps score. Suddenly it does show up in physical manifestations, and it's hard to piece that together and see it in yourself. It's hard to feel curious about that when shame is your overwhelming emotion.
Right. And that's why we have to be curious and ask the right questions, because the person who's having bladder spasms or IBS, whatever it may be, and just thinks, well, this is going on in me. Like, okay, maybe, right? But maybe it's coming from somewhere that you just aren't linking to that, right? And a person isn't supposed to know that, right? That's what physicians, it's what medical care is for. So if you don't understand, get the information, even if you think it obviously can't be related, right? People will say that it can't, well, it couldn't be, but it can be. I mean, trauma can paralyze a limb. It's real and true story. We know trauma can do anything to us. That is actually true, right? That a certain trauma in a certain person, right, paralyzed a limb for years and years and years and years. Right? Like, we know, and it's not just one case. Like, if trauma can do that to us, it can do anything from head to toe. So think about ourselves. What's going on inside of us? And again, the chronic traumas are the easiest ones to not see as they're happening to us. So we want to really shine the spotlight on processes that happen across time that can change us in mind and body, that also have some sense of societally imposed stigma in some ways about it. We have to look at that and say, hey, this is exactly the place where like this flies under the radar, and then creates a lot of avoidable unhappiness, a lot of avoidable misery and suffering.
And I think that's all too common, where people will go through therapy of some sort, come out the other end and go, why didn't I do that 15 years ago? Why didn't I do that 10 years ago? I've lived like this for this long. Oh my gosh. Imagine my life if I would have made this step. And that's why I love talking to you about this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I very much wish to change how we view mental health. Like we don't view body health from the perspective of first and foremost, or first, second, third, fourth, fifth, what is wrong with you? We don't do that. We talk about how do we take care of ourselves, nutrition, exercise, right? How do we be aware if there's a problem, we want to address it. But we conceive of our bodies from let's be healthy. There's a big ethic in the world around us to see ourselves that way, and health movements and all, they're very, very good. But mental health, we still see from if we're talking about mental health, we're talking about what's wrong. That makes no sense whatsoever. What's going on inside of here is like the most important thing to our happiness, our state of mind, like how much comes from our brain. But we see that through the lens of what's wrong, which also creates the stigma. Like people don't have a stigma over, I want to be healthier and I want my body to be stronger. Nobody feels a stigma about that, right? But we say mental health is an automatic stigma because we don't look at it from, let's talk about what's healthy in you. How do we foster greater health in you, right? And if there's something there to talk about that's not healthy, well, let's figure that out. So it's like if someone has a physical exam before they're going to really start an exercise protocol. I mean, there's something to address before you do it, let's do it. But the whole point is fostering health.
Yeah. Well, and that's my next question as we wrap up this podcast. I am all about the practical and tactical. So as women especially are listening to this, like what is the very first step? If they're listening to this, nodding along, that's me. I'm in my 40s and 50s. I'm feeling a lot of these emotions. I'm having a lot of these, I'm understanding these changes. I can relate to this. What's the first, maybe second step Dr. Paul Conti would suggest?
Also, the first step is find some peace away from whatever is going on around you. Stop, put a full stop to everything, and be curious about yourself. There's so much comes of that. Just stop and think about yourself. And so often we don't do that. With life moves at a fast pace, and we're running ahead so quickly that it's almost like we're tripping ahead. Right? And we don't stop and think. And we got to take full stop. It doesn't take that long. We do 5-10 minutes of time. Like just start being curious about yourself. And if that's hard, you can be curious about yourself and think from head to toe or toe to head. Like, what's anything different in me? Like, am I having, maybe someone knows, yeah, you know what? I am having pain in my ankle. It's been there for a couple months and this makes me miserable. Like maybe it's something like that because they're scanning. Maybe a person notices some sign or symptom that maybe correlates to menopause, whatever it may be, or maybe everything is okay. A person gets to the mind and there's anxiety there. Whatever it may be, look at yourself. If you're curious about yourself and you're finding things are okay, great. Then be curious about the next cool and awesome thing you can do, right? So that's the first step. It's kind of the second too. Do that again, do that a couple of times. Then we see what comes next. Is that a doctor's appointment? Is it a talk with a good friend? Whatever's next is going to be something that's good for the person, but you got to do the first step in order to get there.
Amazing. This has been absolutely amazing. I so appreciate your time, but I want everyone to know where they can find you. Where can they learn more? And of course, your book.
Sure, thank you. There's a website that related to the book that's Dr. So Dr. Paul Conti, DrPaul, my first name, and then Conti. The clinic, and there are about 30 of us here. We practice and we consult. So we do a number of different things from here, and there are about 30 of us doing this kind of work. And that's pacificpremiergroup.com. So just strung together, pacificpremiergroup.com. And we talk on the website part about how we do our work. So even if someone might feel in a position that they might not feel like they're going to connect with us in some way or another, we talk about how do we approach the work that we do. And it is through a trauma-informed lens. And it's through a lens that really what we do is we're in the business of empowerment. So the website will kind of speak to that too. So it can potentially be of help, even if someone may not think they're going to potentially link through to us.
Amazing. This is fantastic. And for everyone, his book is Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic. Dr. Paul Conti, thank you so much for your time. I absolutely loved listening to you through the years. And now to actually have you on the podcast has been a real joy. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you for having me on. I so appreciate it.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rootthehealth.com.